The World Economic Forum has put cybersecurity and fraud as top threats for the entire world.
So does this mean that there's going to be a seismic cyber 9/11 event that changes everything? Or can banks and market infrastructure take steps now to protect themselves? Here to try and give us some answers is Troy Hunt, an independent security architect. Troy, welcome to Sibos TV.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you for being here. Troy, the 9/11 attacks on the USA, the very infrastructure that people had built to serve them was turned into weapons. Where are the points in our financial infrastructure where a cyber 9/11 could take place?
I think it's interesting to sort of define the term. So what does that mean? Most people think of a cyber 9/11 as being some massive online event which is going to change the shape of the world forever. And in terms of how it relates to finance, or frankly just about any other part of life today, is that everything that we interact with is connected in one way or another. It's either directly connected and it's online, it's accessible, or there is a pipeline of connectivity before this thing eventually ends up in our hands. I mean, even disconnected systems still have to come from a manufacturer and still have to go through processes and shipping. And we've seen compromises at those points too. So we're inextricably linked with online events no matter what we do.
And what type of attacks could the banking community itself face?
Well, I mean, obviously one of the big things about banking is that there's financial incentive. So when we think about ROI for cyber actors, there is money at the other side of things. So we see attacks that range from compromises to the banking systems themselves, through to very frequently seeing compromises of people. One of the things that just came up in our panel is that consistently it was people being subject to things like phishing attacks, social engineering attacks, and sometimes the technology itself may not even go wrong, but someone has managed to convince someone to pay that $30,000 that the CEO really wanted. And then we have the problem with the people.
Will the attacks be obvious? You know, we draw the comparison towards 9/11, which was obviously quite apparent, or are the risks of undetected attacks quite real?
Yeah, well, actually, I think that's one of the really interesting things, and we have an interesting industry precedent. So there was what's now sort of well known to be one of the most notorious malicious pieces of software ever, which was called Stuxnet. And Stuxnet infiltrated the uranium enrichment facilities in Iran. And what Stuxnet would do is cause centrifuges to spin just a little bit too fast and burn out. It wasn't like, let's just blow up nuclear facilities and there was like flames and fireballs and things. It was a very slow attack over a period of many years, which took a long time to detect. And that's the sort of thing that could conceivably be going on now, we're not aware of it. So I think it's important to acknowledge that a quote-unquote cyber 9/11 may not necessarily be some big immediate term event. It could be something that happens over a long period of time.
And let's take that thought, because you can live with the awareness of that if you're the bank's CEO, but how is it going to impact on any decisions that you make as the boss and indeed other board members? Because yes, something could be there in the system, but you don't know when it's going to be activated.
Well, this is part of the trouble, and I always find it amusing when an organisation says something along the lines of, we've never been hacked. And it's like, so what you mean is that you don't know that you've ever been hacked. Because time and time again we see in this industry incidents that go undetected for years. The Sony Pictures data breach was a massive incident, and their attackers in that network allegedly for 1 year, not just accessing personal data, but accessing email addresses, accessing unreleased emails. So these things can go unseen for a long period of time before they actually raise to the surface.
Can be quite concerning. How can the banking community protect itself?
So one of the interesting things that we discussed quite a bit in the panel today is that there is a need for education. Now there's a need for education for everyone working in financial institutes and indeed every other walk of life. So a really good example of this is that many organisations, including ones that I've been in before, would do annual security training. So they go, it's like November, we've got to do the security training. Everyone's going to sit down, watch a video, tick the boxes, compliance officer goes, sweet, we're all good, we're fine for another year. That sort of stuff doesn't work really well, and what we're seeing organisations, particularly in the financial sector, do now is things like ongoing integrated training. It's like at any moment you might get an email which is a phishing attack, but it's not really, it's us doing training and we're going to measure how everyone performs. So I love the idea of organisations saying let's make security an integral part of every day as opposed to something we just whack on once a year.
Okay, so let's look at the banks themselves in terms of their thinking. I mean, how broadly should they think about cybersecurity? Because it is constantly evolving. And should that thinking encapsulate their hiring policies or indeed their procurement procedures?
So it's interesting for banks because we constantly talk about different levels of threat actor, as we'd say in the industry. And very typically you hear three threat actors talked about. We talk about hacktivists, we talk about organised crime, and we talk about nation states. And depending on the nature of the service, each threat actor is a different risk. For banking, it's all of them. So we've certainly seen nation-state-led threat actors against financial institutions. There are companies or countries rather out there that will hack for financial gain. Organised crime is obviously massive. But even the hacktivist side of things, and a really good example of this is after the likes of Visa and PayPal stopped taking donations for WikiLeaks, hacktivists were very, very effective at knocking these services offline. They mounted distributed denial of service attacks that literally made these services unavailable and cost huge amounts of money. So it's tricky for financial institutions because it's every single one of these threat actors has their own motives for wanting to have a go at them.
Troy, finally, if you were to leave the audience with the one thing that organisations should be doing to protect themselves, what would that be?
Look, I think the one thing is people education, because we just so consistently see people being the weak link. People fall for phishing attacks. People transfer money in ways that they wouldn't have if they had have known what the objectives were. People use bad passwords. Passwords are so frequently the vector by which someone enters the network. And people watching this right now will be using the same one or two or three passwords across everything. And they're going to get compromised here, and then that's just going to cascade and lead down to everything else. And if we could just fix that password problem and the human behaviour problems, it would just make a fundamental difference to the industry.
Okay, so some sound advice there. But Troy Hunt, thank you so much for joining us on Sibos TV.
Thank you.